Okay, we're going to continue our discussion of monetary policy now. The topics for today are going to be two. One is how to determine the short-term interest rate if you are running the Federal Reserve, and the demand for money is going to be very much part of that. And then second, we're going to consider this idea that the interest rate cannot go below zero. Short-term interest rate is bounded at the bottom by zero. That's the zero interest rate bound, and that gives rise to the concept of a liquidity trap. So let's get started. We've discussed what the money supply is. It's the sum of currency plus deposits at banks that can be used for transactions purposes. We know that the Fed can control the money supply by controlling the amount of currency, the amount of Federal Reserve notes, and it also by controlling the amount of reserves. Bank reserves are the reserves that the commercial banks like Wells Fargo hold at the Federal Reserve. Deposits of Wells Fargo and other banks at the Fed, those are reserves. And we know there's a relationship between deposits and bank reserves. The reserve ratio, little r, is how much reserves banks hold as a fraction of their deposits. So the amount of deposits is just 1 over r times the amount of bank reserves. So the Fed can buy bonds in the open market. That's an open market operation. And when it buys bonds, it pays the banks who it buys the bonds from by increasing their reserves. So reserves goes up. And it can also sell bonds to reduce reserves. When it sells bonds, it reduces the amount of reserves that the banks held at the Fed. So that's how the money supply is set and controlled by the Fed, both through currency and deposits, and the deposits work through the bank reserves. Now let's think about money demand. Haven't focused on that, but money demand is a relationship much like any other demand curve. You'll see it's a negative relationship between the interest rate and the quantity of money people are willing to hold. To derive this money demand, we're going to think about just like any other economic problem, and the basic mantra of economics that people make purposeful choices with scarcity. And in this case, the purposeful choice that we're going to set up is to either hold money or to hold some other financial asset that pays interest. We're going to stress here that money doesn't pay interest. Clearly, the cash you carry around in your pocket or wallet or purse doesn't pay any interest. Deposits frequently pay a little bit of interest, but very little. So to make it simple, just think of your choices to hold currency, which pays no interest, and some other financial asset that does pay interest. That other financial asset could be a government bond that pays interest, for example. And so the choice, therefore, is money with no interest and the financial asset that pays interest. Now, if you think about it, the interest rate on the other asset is an opportunity cost of holding money. If you hold a lot of money in your pocket or under your mattress or wherever you want to hide your money, that means you're foregoing the interest that you could get if you put that money in a bond, which paid interest. And so the interest rate on these other assets is an opportunity cost of holding money. That's the cost you're implicitly paying. You're missing on that benefit you're by holding money, and that's the cost, opportunity cost of holding money. So in this sense, you'll see, and now it makes common sense from an economic perspective, is the higher is the opportunity cost of holding money, the less money you'd want to have. The higher is the interest rate on the financial assets that's the alternative of money, the less money you want to hold. And that indeed is the money demand curve. Again, think about it in your own terms. If your choice is between holding a lot of cash, a lot of currency, and the alternative is to put your money somewhere you get interest, the higher interest you could get, the less money you're going to hold. If you could get 10% interest, you're going to hold less money than if you could get 1% interest. That's the money demand curve. Now let's graph this money demand curve. There it is. We now want to think about the economy as a whole. We describe this demand curve as coming from individual choice about currency versus an interest-bearing asset. There's lots of people in the economy, of course, and they have the same basic behavior, not exactly the same, but that same phenomenon will occur. And so therefore, in the aggregate, there should be a negative relationship between the quantity of money held and the interest rate, and there it is. Downward sloping, don't know exactly what its curvature would be, but here's an example of that. Now let's get to the purpose here, is to figure out how the central bank controls the interest rate. The money supply can be determined by the central bank, and so let's suppose the central bank sets the interest at that point. If you're running the central bank, you know you can set that money at any level you want by adjusting the currency and reserves. If it's at the blue line, there's only one intersection between the blue line and the money demand curve, between money supply and money demand, and that's at the interest rate that's shown there, the intersection of the two curves. And so the Fed has determined the interest rate. It's a market interest rate. An interest rate is determined in the market. The Fed isn't saying the interest rate should be 3.2%. It's moving the money supply to that point that gets you to 3.2 if in fact that's where the horizontal line intersects the vertical axis. Now you can think about changing the interest rate. So over on the left we have an example where the money supply changes, and on the right we have another example where the money supply changes in different directions. In both cases, we have the interest rate on the vertical axis and the quantity of money on the horizontal axis. And in both cases, we have the downward sloping money demand curve, which is meant to be the same. But on the left, we're going to increase the money supply, and on the right, we're going to decrease the money supply. So as you can see pretty clearly, on the left, the increase in the money supply makes the interest rate come down. The initial intersection is over on the upper left-hand side at this point of the diagram. And so the shift over the curve, the Fed provides more money, and we know how that occurs. You're going to move along the money demand curve till you get a lower interest rate. And at that lower interest rate, people are now happy holding this additional money. They wouldn't want to hold that much money if the interest rate was at its original point, but now the interest rate is lower, they're satisfied holding a larger amount of money. The opportunity cost of holding that money has declined. There you see the Federal Reserve changing the interest rate. And on the right-hand side of the diagram, we have the opposite. So I suppose the Fed wants to lower the interest rate to stimulate the economy. In this example, we're starting over at the lower intersection, and the Fed increases the interest rate by reducing the quantity of money, and the interest rate rises to the new intersection. In this case, with less money in the economy, the money supply down, people have to be happy holding that smaller amount of money. They're on their money demand curve, and they are only happy with a higher interest rate. Higher interest rate raising the opportunity cost of holding the money. So that's how it works. Money supply changes are implied and work along with the interest rate changes. And then finally, let's consider this idea of the lower bound on the interest rate, sometimes called the liquidity trap. It can be illustrated with the same kind of diagram with money demand on the curve, represented by the downward sloping line, and money on the horizontal axis and the interest rate on the vertical axis. I've given three different places where the money supply is, depending on what the central bank is doing. And as you can see here, since money doesn't pay interest, think about currency. Currency doesn't pay an interest at all, and it certainly doesn't pay a negative interest. And so at some point, you can't reduce the interest rate below zero. And so there's this lower bound on the interest rate at zero. And as the Fed produces more and more money, the interest rate falls as it must, but it falls by smaller and smaller amounts, and it actually becomes asymptotic to the horizontal axis at zero. And so that's this lower bound on the interest rate. It's sometimes called a liquidity trap. The term goes back to John Maynard Keynes. It's called liquidity because liquidity is another name for money. Money is something you can readily use to buy something. You can take the money from your purse or wallet and buy something quickly. It's liquid. You don't have to go sell something. Your house is not liquid. You have to sell your house in order to buy something. A car is not liquid because you have to sell the car if you want to buy something. But currency is quite liquid. You just exchange it. It's ready to go to buy something. So liquidity is another word for money. And this trap represents the fact that there's a trap. Even with more and more money, you can't go below zero. And this liquidity trap, or zero lower bound, is a phenomenon, of course, in the real world. The question is, how does it affect monetary policy? And what should the central bank do if it wants to lower the interest rate, or wants to do something to lower the interest rate? when it can't because it's at this zero lower bound or faced with the liquidity trap. We'll want to consider that in the next few lessons. Thank you.